I've had this like rant in my back pocket for a while, and I've never had an excuse or a reason to deliver it, or more so maybe just that I keep forgetting about it, but it's just one of those things I have on standby. And it's a topic I feel very strongly about, and that is Metroidvanias. Not the genre, like, whether or not I like it or not, but the term Metroidvania, the term for, like, the genre or subgenre, whichever you want to label it as, the term Metroidvania is terrible. It's a bad term. And I'm going to explain why. Actually, I wrote an entire article about this like 2 years ago on my website when I was still doing that, about why Metroidvania is a bad term. And I don't have to read off of it because I know it so well. So, okay. Do I even need to explain? I'll give like, for the sake of setting everything up of my argument, we'll get a little history lesson. So, let's unpack the term Metroidvania. The first half of it is Metroid. So Metroid obviously is the series of, I don't know, like search, exploration, adventure type games. I guess that's how you would describe it. It's games where you are dropped onto, you get dropped into a world, and there are so many paths available to you, and most of the paths lead to dead ends, except for the one path that gives you the one thing you need to unlock the next thing. And then the next thing leads to two more paths, or one of the previous paths. The next thing leads to two more paths, and one of them is blocked off. But you find a thing in the other one that lets you go down like the first door you saw or something like that. It's that kind of a design, right? I feel like everyone knows what Metroid is, right? But that is the basic premise. And to be honest, there weren't too many games that were quite like it. There's a couple, like Clash at Demon Head for NES kind of vaguely steers into that direction, but it's not exact. And then, okay, so Castlevania. Castlevania is the other half of Metroidvania. So Castlevania, the first, 5, 6 games, probably more, were all just very straightforward 2D action platformers. That's it, just linear, level-to-level action platformers. Then, all of a sudden, in 1997, pretty sure it was 97, Symphony of the Night comes out. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And Symphony of the Night is a dramatic departure from anything previously in the series. Symphony of the Night basically... Okay, fuck it. Microphone came unplugged. Symphony of the Night basically adopted a completely different structure from the previous Castlevania games. So instead of just being a level-to-level linear affair, Symphony of the Night had a much more open environment. Essentially, you're in Dracula's castle, and then your goal is to kill Dracula. How do you get to Dracula? Well, you got to explore the castle. So, for instance, it has this a style that is very similar to Metroid, where you'll be presented at the start with, let's just say, 3 doors, A, B, and C. Doors A and B are dead ends. Door C leads to something that gets you an item, and then you go back to door B, and you can open it, or you can get past whatever the roadblock was there, and then you so on and so forth. Very Metroid-like structure, essentially. And people didn't really know what to call it, because there was a lot of things going on in that game that hadn't really been... the individual elements were nothing new, but the fact that they had been combined in that specific way was new. And it felt like something that could be replicated. Like, oh, this could be a little... This needs like a new term to describe it. So people looked at the new structure that it added, or that it implemented, the Metroid-like structure, and they called it, oh, well, it's not like a Castlevania game, it's like a Metroidvania game. And that description seems like it suffices, but it doesn't. If you actually if you've actually played a Metroid game and then played Symphony of the Night, it really doesn't. The reason for that is pretty simple. It's because it's incomplete. The term Metroidvania does not accurately describe the games that fall under the genre, or the subgenre. It's not a fitting label. And so in my mind, that makes it not useful and not a good term. So what do I mean by it doesn't accurately describe? Okay. So, yeah, you got Castlevania with a Metroid kind of structure of progression. Sort of. There is one huge element that is missing from the label Metroidvania that it does not, that is very crucial to a game like Symphony of the Night and games, other games in the genre. And that is the RPG elements. So this might take a little bit of explaining. This is like another, I got to explain some stuff, because a lot of people are surprisingly, well, not really surprisingly, because it's a very weird term. The actual meaning of what an RPG element is kind of vague for most people, but it has a very specific meaning that you can apply to a ton of things, or that you can see in a bunch of things. I mean, so okay, it's a confusing term on its face, because RPG stands for role-playing game. So a role-playing game element would be, oh, isn't that just anything that lets you role play as a different kind of character, or a fictional character? No. No. That then pretty much every game would fall under role-playing game, but they don't. And the reason for that is because RPG does not actually refer to role-playing, which might sound weird. RPG originates from probably other games before this, but mainly Dungeons and Dragons. You could probably find some other game that fits, that did this earliest, but really we're going to just talk about Dungeons and Dragons, because that game is ridiculously influential on a ton of game design. So, Dungeons and Dragons was essentially concocted as, how would you tell your own fantasy story just using your imagination and pen and paper and a set of dice or something. So, how do you create a super extensive fantasy world that you can interact with and play a character in, without it just being and provide specifically yeah, anyone can do that. You can just role play. But if you want to make a game out of that, if you want a role-playing game, that has new requirements, because games need to have rules. There has to be an objective. You want to say, okay, I don't just want to necessarily role-play. I want this to also have some kind of element that I can succeed or fail at or make decisions in, and have that have some kind of weight, because games provide something like a failure state, like a game over or a loss or a death. And that means that things have serious consequences, let's say. And that is exciting. That's exciting in the same way, is soccer very interesting if there's no score? Not really. It's pretty much just a scrimmage. I want some stakes to my fantasy role-playing, so I'm going to make it a game. So how do you apply rules to a thing where a game where it's just writing down stuff on paper and rolling die and stuff like that? You do it by grounding elements of the world into quantifiable values. So here's what I mean by that. In short, it's numbers. It's numbers. So, let's imagine that I am a dungeon master, and my players are going through a dungeon, and they come to a chest, and there is a risk that this chest could be a mimic, right? That it could be a trap in some way, and that opening it is a bad idea. Or it could have something valuable inside of it. So one of the players has the courage, let's say, to open the chest, or even better yet, let's say the chest itself is not trapped, but there's like a tripwire or something, and my player has a high enough perception stat, which God, I'm getting into fucking mic unplugged again, bitch. The player is able to correctly identify that there is a trap, and they're able to disarm it. So now I say, oh, very good, I want to reward you for catching my little trap. So I'm going to give you a sword that is stronger than the sword you currently have. That's how you want to reward. You want to make them more powerful in some way. You could reward them with like gold or something, but like you want to do it with a sword. You want to give them a stronger sword or weapon or something. Let's keep it simple. How is this sword, let's say they have the silver sword, I'm giving them the gold sword. How is the gold sword better than the silver sword? Well, there's a number of ways that you could go about doing that. But a very clear, obvious way is to make the gold sword literally do more damage. So instead of having like 5 attack, it has 10 attack or something like that. And this applies all over. How much, like, you're in combat with an enemy. Well, how do I know? I mean, in real life, killing something is a little more complicated than just getting, like, either HP value down to 0. So, like, okay, how do I know exactly? How do my players know exactly when they've killed a monster or something? Oh, it literally has a health value or endurance or something like that, and they lower it by attacking it to 0. So RPG elements are basically a way to take abstract concepts like health or damage dealt or something like that, or stats like perception, endurance, charisma, completely abstract ideas, and turn them into quantifiable values, numerical values, taking these ideas and turning them into real numbers. And in that way, there's a couple. So in that way, it grounds elements of the role playing enough that you can actually interact with them in a way that has like stakes, in a way that there's rules, because if your character takes a hit and the whether or not you die is completely at the whim of you die from that hit or you don't, that does not really create an interesting game. One of the other things that RPG elements, this is why they're called RPG elements, because this is what grounds the role playing, does, is that it makes players accountable for certain things, like your character's stats, something like that. It allows the player typically to interact with these values, right? Like when you come across a stat check in an RPG where it says you need this much, this high of a speech stat, excuse me, to like get this specific dialogue option that's going to resolve the situation immediately. Well, that's the designer saying you were accountable for getting your speech stat that high. An alternative, doing this without RPG elements, would be some kind of like a dialogue tree where you would have to pick, there's no stats involved. You're literally just picking the options that are going to resolve the conflict, right? As opposed to, here is the stat-gated dialogue choice that's going to do that for you. It's going to give you the best outcome. Okay, so all of this to say is that I need to establish what an RPG element is. And once you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere, you know? And when look and really notice what has an RPG element, right? Experience. That's freaking everywhere. You know why? Because experience is a completely abstract concept. Like, yeah, we have a rough idea of it, but being able to quantify it into a hard number is useful for the purposes of a game. It does a lot of things like, giving the player an idea of how much left they have to go before they hit, another level. Which creates this the progression system. Like you get a progression system which has all these other effects on the game. RPG elements are very useful, which is why you see them everywhere. One of the I think the biggest thing that Symphony of the Night did, that it added to the Metroid formula, was RPG elements. If you play, let's say, Super Metroid, and then you play Symphony of the Night, those are not similar games. They have similar structures, but the inclusion of RPG elements is completely changes the dynamics and the progression of Symphony of the Night. I guess as a side note, I should say, so for instance, there's like a thing about like, is having like, hearts in Zelda, is that like an RPG element? Sort of. Kind of. It's like a weird half pseudo step, in my opinion, at least. There's probably arguments back and forth that you could have about it, but it's like, yeah, it is quantifying a pretty abstract idea into like a symbol or like a meter, but I get, maybe you could say like a soft RPG element as opposed to a hard one. Like if it was just a number, right? In like a classic 2D Mario game, when you can only take one hit until you get the mushroom or a power-up, and then you can take 2 hits. So that is not an RPG element, because Mario literally, there is no numerical tie-in to that, essentially. There's or numerical expression of that idea. It's just kind of, I don't know if there's really a term for it. But it's not an RPG element. If, for instance, Mario like stayed the exact same, but then you got a mushroom and you had a little health point thing that said instead of 1 health points you have 2, that would be an RPG element. I guess if and even if he did change and you had that kind of a system, it still wouldn't really matter. I think I defined it in really clear terms in that article. Can I? I gotta hang on. Yeah, let me go to my website. I really like the way that I described it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh man, this is an old article. Okay. Oh God, this is long. Where is it? Okay. An RPG, this is what I wrote back in 2020. An RPG is a game where the logic of the player-facing system relies on representing real-world concepts as abstract values. Wait, that's not... I fucking wrote that wrong. Or did I say it wrong? It's kind of the same thing. Sort of the same thing. And that kind of applies to both. It's turning things into numbers. So let's go into... What did I write after that? A Fallout is an RPG. You make a character and role-play as them through a large open world making constant story decisions. But 1987's Final Fantasy is also an RPG. Even though character creation is about as deep as naming your party, the game is generally linear, and you aren't faced with choices that will impact the narrative. I mean, I guess character creation. Yeah, character creation, I said, not customization. However, in both games, when you pick up a new weapon, that weapon does not kill monsters faster because, quote, it's the gold sword compared to your copper sword. It does so because your copper sword is 5 attack and the gold sword is 10. That's what I wrote back in 2020. To give a more focused example, take Super Mario Bros. When Mario is small, he can only take one hit, but after collecting a mushroom, he grows and can take a second hit. Of course, there might be a series of numerical values behind the health system, but that's not the player-facing logic. So even here, I pointed out, it's important that, like, obviously every game has numbers going on under the hood, but not every game makes those apparent to you. If Mario were an RPG, not talking about the actual Mario RPG, it would be presented as such. Mario has 1 hit point. Collecting/using a mushroom gives him a second hit point. Now you're working with abstract values. You could remove the visual of Mario changing size and it would make as much sense to the player. This, I believe... Oh yeah, I'm just going to quote myself because I'm so good. This, I believe, more than anything else, is what separates Symphony of the Night from Super Metroid. The RPG elements completely change the progression of the game by shifting the focus from player growth to avatar growth, or the shift from mastering mechanics to overcome the obstacle versus increasing your character's abstract level until you're beefy enough to overcome the obstacle. I guess I should mention that, like, here's another distinction between those two games, is that in Metroid, generally, you do not get, like, you rarely, besides kind of the suit upgrades, but even then it's only, like, part of the upgrade. In Metroid, most of the weapons or upgrades you get have dual purposes, as in the tool, for instance, you get the ice beam, and yeah, the ice beam can be used for combat. The ice beam can also be used to freeze enemies and jump on them for platforming sections. There's, you know, famously, like, what is it, the entrance to Norfair or something like that, or getting out of Norfair is something like that you can only do if you can freeze enemies so that you can use them as platforms. And it's like Super Metroid. You get the missiles. Obviously, the missiles are a weapon, but this is even more blunt example. The missiles open doors. There are doors that only missiles can open. Let's go back to my article. My first few hours in Symphony were spent pitifully weak, using dinky swords with short reach. I was struggling to get a hang of the movement and accustoming myself to the many dances you need to learn to fight enemies appropriately. Suffice to say, it was challenging and a bit of a slog, but I knew from that introductory segment, which everyone probably knows about, that at some point I was going to get all of my stuff back and be that overpowered badass once again. Then, at some point, around the 4-hour mark, the game just plateaued. Something you must face as a designer when implementing an RPG progression system is that the sooner the player is given the chance to grind their character without much risk, they can and will do so until they're at least a little too strong. This window of opportunity is where the game's difficulty curve risks flattening. Once I reached a high enough level and acquired a good weapon, Symphony of the Night's difficulty became almost trivial, checking items off of a list and blowing through every enemy the game threw at me with a few strikes. And I'll admit, it does feel good to meet the green armor guy for the first time, barely eking out a victory as he shaves off 2/3 of your health, only to return to the same area and dispatch him in 4 hits. This is a double-edged sword, however, because the instant you drop into a new area and you're faced with enemies who are around your level, the spike in difficulty can be downright frustrating. Spending 5 hours breezing through the game only to be stopped dead in my tracks pissed me off more than it excited me because the pacing suffered a dramatic gear change. By contrast, because Super Metroid doesn't use RPG progression, the difficulty can be tuned with a fair amount of precision by paying mind to what items and weapons the player needs to reach certain areas, and then designing enemies and environments to challenge them at that level. I don't want to imply that Metroid is some hardcore skill-based game and Symphony of the Night is just arbitrarily difficult. I'm just trying to illustrate the profound impact that RPG elements have on a game's design. It has to be approached in almost a completely different way. They take a lot of control from the designer's hands and put it into the players. Remember what I said about accountability? Which can be exciting, but hazardous. If the developer wants to maintain a certain difficulty, they have to pay close attention to what opportunities they're giving the player. This is why most people don't play RPGs for challenge as much as they do the other strengths of the genre. Story, characters, ideas. Really, these are many strengths of Symphony of the Night. Its ambience, music, art direction, the intricate world and multitude of dynamic enemies, the sheer size and scope of exploration, and the experimentation that the equipment system offers. Okay. I sort of go off talking about my thoughts on Symphony of the Night and how it... basically, I just felt like, should I talk about it? I don't know. I'll skip over that. You can go read it for yourself. Basically, just like why I think the RPG element... It's designed in a completely different way, basically. Because the player is given so much freedom, because the progression system is really just, hey, do you want to stand in front of a respawning enemy for 20 hours and just grind them until you're like max level? That's a possibility. It is a thing you can do. Most people aren't going to do it, but it's something you can do. And the fact that that even exists makes the game essentially ultimately more of a playground when I was really thinking about it. And I finally, okay, I'm going to get to, let's see, my kind of part of my thesis. When I say that Metroidvania as a term is undescriptive, I mean that it's shallow. Super Metroid is a tight, focused experience with wonderful level design, and comparing it to Symphony of the Night is almost a logical folly. The latter is a wide-open playground to mess around in. Yeah, I remember that word choice. Encouraging your creativity with its own range of mechanics, its hundreds of items and foes. The beauty of Symphony of the Night is how free and lackadaisical it is with its core design decisions, that liberty. What at the time seemed to me like sloppy implementation of another game's ideas was just a closed-minded view of what it was actually trying to accomplish, what the quote-unquote Metroidvanias that follow it are trying to accomplish. I guess I talked about this much earlier in that article. So my problem with the term Metroidvania and why I think it's undescriptive, beyond what I literally just said, is that as a term, it is like... Okay, so let's actually like really break it down. Metroidvania. It is describing... This was a term that was used to categorize Symphony of the Night when it came out, because there was nothing else like it. It is a term that describes the structure of a Metroid game with the aesthetics of Castlevania. Now, if you think about that for a second, that doesn't make any sense to apply to any game that is not a Castlevania game or has a similar gothic kind of aesthetic. Like, I don't know, like Axiom Verge. I don't know if that game technically... I haven't played it, but I don't know if it technically falls under Metroidvania. But like, that's not... people. There's probably people out there who would call it a Metroidvania, but that is not a gothic Castlevania game that has its own little sci-fi art style. The video game genres have a tough enough time as is because there's so many variables that I think categorizing something by the aesthetics of a different series that this game you're talking about might not necessarily fall into is a really unhelpful thing. And it's also a term that has like an extreme like cultural or historical context required for it. Like having to understand that it was first applied to Symphony of the Night, and how Symphony of the Night was different from the previous Castlevania games, and how it was taking from this other, partially from this other game series, Metroid, is like, if you don't know that stuff, it's like such an impenetrable phrase. Like, what is that supposed to mean? So when I hear that term, unless it is literally, you know who gets to put that on their game? Castlevania games. And Bloodstained, the Iga spiritual successors. They get to put that on their game. But even then, I think it's very, like, it's still extremely undescriptive, because it totally, like, Metroid and the previous, the pre-Symphony of the Night Castlevania games, neither of those games have, like, really hard RPG elements. Not a lot of, like, you know, the numbers. So completely leaving that out is, like, I don't know what you... It's like, I even at the end of that article, like what would you even call this genre? Because, like, Metroidvania is so ingrained now that people just, it has no meaning, almost. It's just, it's when I say it has no meaning, I mean, like, people just say it, and you just sort of understand what it's supposed to mean. Even though a game with and without RPG elements and, like, that kind of progression system, completely different. Totally different kind of experience. I guess I would say, like, the term search action is kind of, like, memed on, but it's, like, not a terrible start. Something like, I don't know, exploration RPG? Something like that? Like, adventure RPG? I mean, that's not great either. Exploration RPG might, I don't know, man, because it's like it's a very specific kind of, like, structure, right? Where you're meant to explore and come to dead ends and explore other paths and then get items that unlock other ways, but you also have these RPG elements in there, and, like, customization and finding different items and stuff like that. I don't know, like, treasure hunt RPGs. There's, like, a lot of it. Leave your suggestions in the comments. I'd be genuinely curious to what kind of alternative genre names you could give to that. Key hunting RPG. You know, something like that. Yeah, so I've had that rant built up just forever, waiting to unleash. And unfortunately, I don't have, like, a super hard, you know, definitive conclusion, other than I think it's a bad term, but it's probably too late to stop using it. I don't like using it. I try to avoid using it when possible, because I think it's bad at describing what it's supposed to describe. I mean, then again, I'm the same guy who plays fighting games, and if you... Oh my god. I think I mentioned fighting games to my dad one time, who knows really nothing about video games besides what I've told him. And he mentioned his reply made it clear to me that he had, like, no idea what I was talking about. And I had to realize, oh, a fighting game is really unclear. It's a really non-descriptive term. Like, yeah, technically it is descriptive, but it's not really, like, when you think of that's why there's a lot of genre breakdowns, like classic 2D fighter. That's sort of better, but yeah, there was a time when beat 'em ups and fighting games were interchangeable terms. So you could find, like, old magazine articles about, like, Final Fight or something, and they call it a fighting game. Or that you find, like, you know, something for a KOF or a Street Fighter, and they call it a beat 'em up. Because it's like, well, it doesn't really... I mean, I guess, actually, now, if I had to pick, I would say that beat 'em up probably works better for that genre, just because, like... beat 'em up is, like, very... I feel like that has, like, a mood, like, a tone to it, that fits the genre much better than just calling it a flat like fighting game. Because in beat 'em ups, it is like, hey, just go beat 'em up, and you're just like, the part of the appeal is just punching down a bunch of, like, a big group of guys or something like that, and picking up a pipe or something, and yeah, you're beating them up. I don't know. It's very like carefree and like casual, which I feel like a lot of beat 'em ups kind of usually tend to fall into. They're a little more just like, hey, just a little bit more of like a honestly, there's probably like, I get that they're like, they can be really difficult, but the mechanics tend not to be super deep, if you get what I mean. Like, you can pick up a beat 'em up super easily. So like the name sounds casual enough to fit. That's it. If you have any thoughts about that, I'd be genuinely curious to know, because I think it's an interesting topic, the Metroidvania discussion.